So with another week of fantasy football that just passed us, a lot of you watching may be very seasoned fantasy football players, and you know that injuries always happen at this time of the year, every single year. And this only makes it that much more critical for us to be thinking about and making the right decisions for our fantasy football playoffs that are upcoming here. And right now, we're fighting for seeding in our particular playoffs. So last week I went over some of the best running back schedules in fantasy football for your playoffs. And a couple weeks before, I discussed players to acquire for your playoffs and players to avoid for your fantasy football playoffs. Now we're getting into the best fantasy football playoff schedules for wide receivers in fantasy football. And I'm very interactive with the audience, guys. If you've got a video idea that you need to see before your fantasy football playoffs, just let me know in the comments because I want to provide the content that you guys need to win a fantasy football championship. So please go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. And once I hit 7,500 subscribers, giving away lots of free FFN hats right here. So go down there, let's make it happen right now. So the first guy on the list right here, and it's actually two guys right here on the same team. I love this playoff schedule for Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel. So let's discuss what's happened recently with these two guys specifically. San Francisco just came off a 3-game losing skid. And it was actually kind of embarrassing. Without Deebo Samuel, they just were not the same offense. Now, obviously, they come back against Jacksonville and they look fantastic again. Brock Purdy came back to life. He wasn't looking very good for that 3-game skid. He just didn't look right. He came back and he made it all work. But here's the real secret to the San Francisco 49ers offense. It's actually Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel opens things up for everybody because this guy doesn't just get targets in a game. This is a wide receiver he's a running back who's playing wide receiver a lot of the time. And that's not an insult. He's just a very versatile player, and that makes it great for fantasy football, and it opens up the entire San Francisco offense. Because here's the thing, when they've got all their pieces, Deebo Samuel, obviously Christian McCaffrey, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, when they've got all of them there, they're just an elite offense. They're one of the top tier offenses. And as great as Week 10 versus Jacksonville was, it only gets better from a matchup and competition level standpoint. Weeks 15 through 17, during your fantasy football playoffs, here's the situation of what they're going against. They're going against Arizona, which is the 11th worst team in passing yards allowed. They're going up against Baltimore. Now, that's a tough matchup right there. I'm not acting like Baltimore's some sort of fantastic matchup that's just like under the radar. No, it's as hard as it sounds because they're the 4th best team at defending the pass. But if you can get past Baltimore, you've got Washington in the championship game, and they're the 4th worst team at defending the pass. And they're actually just getting worse. There are lots and lots of opportunities here for both Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel to have very good fantasy football games. And here's the thing that I always say. If you're a new viewer and you're watching this video, what's important to remember here when you're going into your fantasy football playoffs is you want to get guys who are on competitive teams, because here's the problem with teams that are not competitive. Typically around this time of the year, they're going to start maybe not explicitly tanking, but a lot of teams don't really have as much heart and that they're putting into winning as teams that are looking for playoff seeding. Think about the Bears, the Panthers. They can only benefit. Well, the Bears can only benefit since they have the Panthers pick as well. The Bears can only benefit from getting more losses. So they're not as motivated to win a game as San Francisco is, for example. So not only is San Francisco going to be fighting for playoff seeding, you look at Arizona, their matchup in Week 15, Arizona's already toast. And I get it. They came back and they won their first game with Kyler. And that's a good thing for just their team morality, for just the sake of their team morality. That's a good thing. But Arizona's already toast. They're 2-8 right now. Washington, their championship matchup, they're going to be out by then. They won't be a factor in the playoffs by then. So they're not going to be much to worry about. And Baltimore is the toughest test. As I said, there's no sugarcoating that Baltimore is a tough test. But this is an offense that can match most. And they can go up against top tier defenses and play really, really good football. Jacksonville is a top tier defense, and they just smoked Jacksonville. I would try to buy one of these two guys. I think you could get away with sending a DK Metcalf, a Tyler Lockett level guy for one of these guys, because the reality is the skill set that they both possess, the offense that they're on, gives them that high upside, and the matchups they've got. I think that these are some very good playoff options at the wide receiver position. The next guy we've got up here is he's a no-brainer, and I'm not saying that you're likely going to buy this guy, but Amon-Ra St. Brown, his playoff schedule is fantastic. Like I said, everybody knows that Amon-Ra St. Brown is a great fantasy football player. We're not going to fool anybody at this point and say, I'll give you, Christian Kirk for Amon-Ra St. Brown. You're not going to be able to get that deal done. This is not a buy low video. The buy low video was earlier on Monday. This is not a buy low video, so we need to make sure we're clear on that. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's got some big matchups in the playoffs. Weeks 15 through 17, your fantasy football playoffs. He's got Denver in week 15, 10th worst at stopping the pass. Minnesota, 9th worst at stopping the pass. Their defense is better, but their secondary is the problem. And then they've got Dallas championship weekend, which is obviously not good. They're the 3rd best defense at defending the pass. Again, that's a defense just like we were talking about with the 49ers. That's going to be a struggle game. I'm not saying that he's going to come out and have some 200-yard game against Dallas as they cruise to victory. As I said, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to buy Amon-Ra St. Brown at this point. This is the type of guy that just went for 150 yards in week 10. And if you've got him, you're set up. And you don't want to get rid of this guy because he's a massive contributor to your team. So if someone comes at you as an Amon-Ra St. Brown owner and they're trying to offer you a couple of role players like James Cook and Michael Pittman level guys to get Amon-Ra St. Brown, they're probably not going to say yes because neither one of those guys is a showstopper like Amon-Ra St. Brown is. The point of this is to say, don't look to sell. You probably won't be able to buy, but if you have him, don't look to sell Amon-Ra St. Brown. I wouldn't even sell him for a guy like Stephon Diggs, honestly, or CeeDee Lamb. And the reason why is because they're so close to him. So when guys are that close in the rankings for me, you have to start splitting hairs. You got to nitpick these guys. And I like his playoff schedule the best. The offense, actually, I think arguably in Detroit is the best offense between Buffalo and Dallas. I prefer Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think his playoff upside is higher than both those guys. And that's why I'm saying you probably won't be able to buy him. If you can, that's a fantastic move that I would advise doing. But if you have him, do not look to sell him. This guy is going to be a clear-cut top-tier fantasy option in your playoffs this year. The next guy I got up here is on another very competitive team. And this is a very buyable guy right now. It's Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So over the past several weeks, we've seen horrific blowouts, right? And that happens every single year. That's nothing new about this particular year, but we've seen some massive blowouts. Baltimore beating the snot out of Detroit and also Seattle as well. And Jacksonville just getting their butts handed to them by San Francisco. Now, what I like to do from a fantasy football perspective is when I see those types of losses, I like to go look for if there was a lone bright spot in that loss. Maybe a guy like what Jahmyr Gibbs was when they got creamed by the Baltimore Ravens a couple weeks ago in Detroit. I like to look at those kinds of guys. Kenneth Walker, also not a lone bright spot in that game, but a guy who I do believe would have the value moving forward. So over the past several weeks, I mentioned two guys as buy lows after embarrassing losses that we were just discussing. Kenneth Walker and Jahmyr Gibbs. And they both turned out great. Not only on Sunday in week 10, but Jahmyr Gibbs has been playing great ever since that loss. Christian Kirk was the lone bright spot. Not Travis Etienne. Not Evan Ingram. Christian Kirk was the lone bright spot in that week 10 beatdown versus the San Francisco 49ers. He had 100 yards in week 10. 100 plus yards, actually. And it gets better from here. Not only is their playoff schedule great, which I'll get to here in a second, but their next 3 games, they've got Tennessee, weak passing defense, Houston, also a weak passing defense, and Cincinnati that just got carved up by CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans receivers. Those are their next 3 matchups right here. So I already really like the schedule here in the immediate term for a guy like Christian Kirk. And then in your playoffs, here's what we've got. You've got Baltimore in week 15. Again, not sugarcoating that. That's a tough matchup right there. Then they've got Tampa Bay. That's the 5th worst defense at stopping the pass in week 16. And then Carolina, which right now is 7th best. Here's the reality of that, though. The reason that teams are good against them is because they can run on them. They don't need to throw. So no team is really having to pass too much against Carolina because they're getting in such early leads and then just draining the clock. That's the secret about Carolina and why they're 7th best right now at defending the pass. That's not going to last. They're an awful team. So essentially what you can do, if you get past Baltimore in week 15, Christian Kirk is set up for big time success. And I've always been a Christian Kirk guy, and the reason for it is because he's the most consistent target guy. You go back to my offseason videos. For those of you who are new to my channel, go back to my offseason videos. I consistently said I prefer Christian Kirk over Calvin Ridley because he's a target getter and he's got great chemistry already with Trevor Lawrence. Now is the time to go get him. Even after a decent performance, this is a guy you can get, I believe, for a DK Metcalf, for a Tyler Lockett. I would even sell Cortland Sutton for Christian Kirk because the reality is none of those guys have the consistency of targets and the upside in the playoffs that Christian Kirk does. The last guy on the list right here, it's honestly hilarious. And honestly, I just got to get into it. It's Hollywood Brown of the Arizona Cardinals. The reason this one is so funny to me, guys, is because for weeks now, I've been saying to sell Hollywood Brown. In fact, in the players to avoid playoff video, I said that Marquise Brown was a player to avoid. It's hilarious because not only that, but he's coming off a bust performance in week 10. It's not like he came out in week 10 and was some stud with Kyler Murray again. That's not what happened. So my take on it actually sounds like it was right at the time, right? I believe that it was right. And I'm not going back on it. I'm not going back on it because the reason why I ultimately don't think that he's a fantastic fantasy football playoff player is because, again, Arizona Cardinals will not be competitive. They're not going to be competitive. They're already finished. So long term, in the playoffs, you want players on competitive teams. But I got to be honest here, I can't ignore his playoff schedule. It's almost about as good as it gets. In weeks 15 through 17, he takes on the San Francisco 49ers. 13th best right now, about middle of the pack, but their weakness actually has been through the air. We'll see if that continues. They obviously just played a very dominant game versus Jacksonville. But then they've got Chicago in week 16, dead last at defending the pass. And then Philadelphia, which on paper sounds like a very tough matchup. They're 2nd worst at defending the pass. 2nd most passing yards allowed. This playoff schedule cannot be ignored. Here's the thing. The ultimate reality here with what I advise my audience to do with a guy like Hollywood Brown is I would advise you to buy him for only certain players. Do not go out and try to outsmart somebody by trading Michael Pittman or Mike Evans for him. That's not what I'm advising. Don't trade a guy like Nico Collins for Marquise Brown. I want a lowball. And especially after a bad week 10, this can be done. I would lowball offers. Someone like a Josh Downs, a Zay Flowers, a Chris Godwin for Marquise Brown, because while I don't love his situation, while I don't think Arizona's going to be competitive, there's no ignoring this playoff schedule. And the reality is there is a chance that he actually has some very, very sneaky high-end playoff upside in 2023 fantasy football. So let me know who you are actively targeting for your fantasy football playoffs in the comments below and what questions you need answered before week 11 fantasy football. And if you want to see some buy low trade targets before week 11 fantasy football, click on this video right here.